Okay, lesson 4, a relatively little short, tiny little lesson on the League of Nations and the Great Depression. One of the things you need to understand before we get into an evaluation of how the League of Nations fared in the 1930s is you need to know that the 1930s circumstances for all countries around the world, including the United States, and most particularly the United States, begins to change. And that affects, of course, the world and the League of Nations. Now, we know of the Great Depression as the Wall Street crash. In many ways, the Wall Street crash is the symbol of the beginning of the Great Depression. Most people actually incorrectly believe that the Wall Street crash caused the Great Depression. In fact, the depression, or a decline in economic growth, which characterizes a depression, actually began before the Wall Street crash. The signs were on the wall from 1928 forward. Most people didn't realize it, but by 1929, a lot of people started to realize it. And because people spent and invested so heavily in the 1920s in this new vehicle of economic growth known as the stock exchange, that when they realized a depression was coming and that the value of the stocks that they did own would decline, most people tried to sell. And as more people tried to sell, people began to panic, thinking, oh no, what is everyone doing? I must sell too. And this leads to what's known as a flash sale or a panic sale. And as a result, in panic sales, when there is too much of something for sale, the price goes down. And stock prices absolutely plummet. And it's very, very, very drastic in what becomes known as Black Thursday in October of 1929. Most people were doing this because they saw the recession had around the corner, but what you need to understand is that the Wall Street crash was incidental. It was this particular time. Of course, stocks will remain in a relatively depressed state, but the depression goes on for years and years and years. And in fact, it is 1931, 1932 before the worst of the depression is actually hitting. Some countries are affected more than others. Probably the biggest country in terms of overall effect, in terms of money lost across the entire country, is the United States. It was the richest country in the world in 1929. Everyone had traded with the United States. American banks lent money worldwide to all over the place. And a lot of countries, as a consequence of this trade, got richer. But because America was so big and prosperous, it was buying a lot of things. So a lot of countries' prosperity was tied to America, not to mention the fact that many countries borrowed large sums of money, and many companies in these countries, such as Germany, borrowed money from American banks to finance growth, to finance projects that they happened to be working on, and so on and so forth. So as a result, when American banks start to go out of business or they stop lending, there's a massive contraction in production and trade between 1929 and 1933. And this affects every capitalist country in the world. But of course, as I mentioned, the United States and Germany were hit worst of all. Germany, in fact, suffers, out of any country in the world, the highest degree of unemployment. At one point in 1932, 1/3 of all German eligible workers are unemployed. The consequences of the Depression had the consequences the Depression had on the League of Nations are quite profound, and they are really fivefold. I'm going to walk you through each one of these consequences because it's important in your analysis of why the the League of Nations failed in the 1930s. You need to put everything in context of the fact of really what could it do. So before you say, oh, they should have done this, you need to weigh up the factors. Are they really in a position to do this? And a lot of that has to do with the Great Depression. The first, probably, and most striking one is the imposing of sanctions. League members are less likely to impose sanctions, particularly economic ones. Of course, world markets are shrinking all the time. Countries are buying less and less. And any existing trading partnerships needed to be maintained basically at all costs. And what we see are countries that should be imposing trade sanctions, not trading with another as punishment for things that they're doing, continuing to trade with them, even though their country might be doing something bad. The best example is Britain and Italy. In the 1935, Italy will invade Abyssinia, as we'll learn, and in consequence of this, Britain will hesitate greatly on putting economic sanctions on the Italians. Just for instance, because Italy buys more coal than any other country, more British coal, I should say, than any other country in the world. So eventually Britain will impose economic sanctions, but you see countries overlooking things all of the time in the interest of the economy during the Great Depression, which actually, for all intents and purposes, lasts until the beginning of the Second World War. Another consequence was a cut in expenditure. When countries are broke and they're having difficulty feeding under their own people, governments become more and more and more hard-pressed to balance their budgets, balance their books. Okay, there's no money to borrow, there's no money to lend, and as such, they have to cut back somewhere. And a lot of people will cut back on things that help the poor, social programs, but more particularly, and one of the easiest things to cut back on is rearmament. Why build bombs and guns when you need to feed your own people? And you see most of the Western countries very acutely, Britain, France, not investing in their armed forces in the 1930s. That means that the key countries of the League of Nations, which could have used their armed forces in terms of military sanction or could threaten other countries by having just a large armed force, don't. And the League members lack the military means to deal with aggressors. And aggressors know this. They sense weakness and are able to take advantage of the military weakness of the members of the League of Nations and get away with territorial conquests in the 1930s. One of the ways, and I guess in many ways, the Great Depression not only disarms certain countries, it also forces countries that are armed to seek new markets. And one of the best ways to do this was through colonizing other countries, or annexing, which means taking new territories. Very much in the 1930s, you see countries like Germany annexing areas of Czechoslovakia, Austria, for instance. In Italy, invading Africa, the country of Abyssinia, which is modern-day Ethiopia and Eritrea, to expand their empire, to create new markets for Italian goods, and to make Italy and Italians more rich. And of course, the more people need to expand and take things to encourage their economy, the more likely it is that it could potentially cause a major war, as we will see in 1939. But you definitely get the Depression causing tension and conflict in the world. One of the other ones, and one of the most obvious consequences for many students, is the fact that it brings extremists to power. Okay, you're looking at extremists to power, most notably in Germany with Adolf Hitler. And Hitler, probably more than anything else, his coming to power is linked to the Great Depression to some degree. Hitler, of course, talks about destroying the Treaty of Versailles and the nasty reparations which Germany had to pay, which he blames for Germany's inability to sort of meet the Depression head-on, blames for the unemployment. And as the recession deepens as a consequence of the Great Depression, more and more Germans are willing to hear the anti-Semitic, hate-filled, scapegoating Nazi policy that Hitler is plugging. And as such, when he plans to sort of invade the neighbors to get back the land lost, Germans vote for him in large numbers. Still not enough to get a majority, but large enough numbers. Additionally, a lot of students tend to believe that Mussolini comes to power as a consequence of the Great Depression, and that's not necessarily true. What is true about the dictator of Italy, Benito Mussolini, is that the 1930s, when he is in power and had been for about 10 years, the economic problems Italy is facing actually encourages him to find other markets. So it does bring extremists to power. In Spain, the nationalists under Francisco Franco will set up a fascist dictatorship as well in the late 1930s. So these are very much consequences of the economic situation, that people are willing to look for extreme solutions. And lastly, there is a militarism in Japan. Now, what we don't, and then we haven't thought about the Asian situation to any large degree at this particular point, but what you need to know is that Japan was an emerging industrial power and an emerging power in the 1920s. In fact, Japan had been growing strong and powerful since about the turn of the century. They win a war against Russia in 1905, and it started to expand through the Pacific, taking some islands like Okinawa and Iwo Jima, a few examples, the Solomon Islands, et cetera, et cetera. Now, in the 1930s, the economic situation forces Japan into a very militaristic mode. The Depression almost bankrupted Japan. Japan's major #1 export at this particular time was silk, in which the United States bought in large quantities. And silk is a luxury item, and people in the 1930s aren't buying luxury items, and therefore Japan needs to find another way to sort of prop itself up. It also lacks raw materials. Japan is composed of, I believe, 4 little islands, and these islands aren't necessarily rich in the things that industry needs: iron ore, coal, minerals, and so on and so forth. And these had to be got from taking over other territories. So, couple that with the fact that the Japanese had been always led in a very militaristic fashion for hundreds of years. And most of the leaders in Japan were generals. And these generals listened to an emperor who himself was also a military leader. And they decided that, given their military backgrounds, which shapes their way of thinking, that it was time for Japan to expand and build an empire of its own in Asia. And the League is confronted by Japan's invasion of what's known then as Manchuria, which is part of modern-day China, and they do so, and they invade in 1931, an incredibly bloody, horrific conflict, which leads to mass atrocities, which, of course, is the subject of another lesson. So you see that militarism, particularly in Asia, builds up, and on the part of the Japanese. My last point for today is the fact that the Depression, in short, brings extremist parties to power in Europe and the Far East. It creates additional need for expansionist foreign policy, and it undermines the ability of the League of Nations to come up with effective ways to counter such an action, either military or in terms of sanctions. And this will set the table for the 1930s and make the work of the League in this context extremely difficult. And that's something I'd like you to consider before you consider whether the League was a complete and abject failure in the 1930s.